Hello and welcome back to computer programming. So today we're going to talk about 2D arrays, which is kind of the natural progression from our discussion of regular arrays. So a 2D array is basically, you can almost think of it as an array of arrays. So not only do we go across, but we start going down as well. And that gives us sort of a table-like structure that we can store and manipulate data. So we'll start this the way we always do. I just need to get the actual files. So open a new window, download, go to my downloads folder, extract all, click extract. And again, at this point, it's up to you, but I get rid of the zip file. I move it into my computer programming folder, and then I open it up. All right, so a lot of it's going to look very similar to arrays. A lot of it is going to be very similar to arrays. All right, so right here, we have our first 2D array. And effectively, what we have here is the first number is the number of rows. The second number is the number of columns in those rows. So if you were kind of think of this as a table, it'd be a table that had 4 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of those rows has 1, 2, 3 columns inside of it. All right, now this right here is just showing you the syntax for initializing a 2D array. So notice that I've got curly braces for the entire initialization, and then each row of the 2D array gets its own curly braces. So this would be in the first row, which much like arrays is numbered row 0. So row 0 has 22, 23, and 10 in it across the 3 columns. And again, the columns are also numbered 0, 1, and 2. So this would be row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2. This would be row 1, column 0, row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, row 2, column 0, row 2, column 1, row 2, column 3. Sorry, column 0, column 1, column 2. And then finally, this is row 3, column 0, row 3, column 1. Notice I left the last one off. Much like regular arrays, if you only initialize part of it, the rest will automatically get set to 0. But if you don't initialize anything, then you have no idea what's going to be inside of it. So again, as long as you do 1, you know that the last one will be 0. If you don't do any, then you have no idea what it's gonna output. Now, because we have both rows and columns, when we're moving through or looking at or printing out or inputting into one of these 2D arrays, instead of using a single for loop, we're going to have to use that nested loop structure that we saw earlier in the course. So this outer loop right now is handling my rows because it goes from 0 to less than 4. All right, and this inner loop is taking care of my columns, so it's going from 0 to less than 3. So while the row is stuck at 0, I will move across my 2D array, column 0, column 1, column 2. Once that finishes, the outer loop will go to 1. I'll move down a row, and then I can go across the columns. So I'm kind of going across and then down, across and then down, across and then down, over and over and over again. Now, I could have set this up the other way where I went down and then over, down and then over, down and then over. But because the rows come first in a 2D array and the columns come second, often you're going to have the outer loop control the rows and the inner loop control the columns. Nothing saying it can't be flipped, but it's just common to sort of set it up that way. This right here is just syntax showing you how you can initialize an entire 2D array to 0. So just empty curly braces will initialize the entire 2D array to 0, which is actually the same syntax for a regular array. So that hasn't changed at all. If you want to make everything 0, that'll work. So let me just run the program quick so that you can see what I was talking about with this initialization. So when I run this, Oh, what's going on here? 1 second. Let me pause this and then I'll come back. All right, we're back up and running. I'm not really sure what happened there. So I'm going to run it, and you'll notice that as it printed out that 2D array, that last element is 0, just like I said it would be. But kind of notice how the inner loop handles printing out each number with a space following it, so 22, 23, 10. And then when that inner loop is over, I hit enter to kind of give it that table-like appearance. All right. So if we go back to the code here, this is just me sort of like asking how many rows, how many columns do you want? Now, this is a structure that, depending on how you've done some of your labs, you may or may not have seen it yet, but it's called a do-while loop. So normally with a while loop, we start with the test, and then we only do the code if the test is true. With a do-while loop, we're basically saying, hey, automatically do this at least once, and then if this is true, go back and do it again. All right. If it's not true, continue on. But this guarantees that you get at least one run of this code before you actually apply the test of the while loop. So very similar to a while loop. It's just called the do while. Notice there's a semicolon at the end of the while here, which is a little unusual. Usually you don't see that when we're setting up loops. But because this marks the end of it, it does have a semicolon here. But all this is basically having them type in how many rows and how many columns they want, with a little bit of error checking to make sure that they don't exceed 100, because that's as large as we made our 2D array here. All right, we made it with 100 rows and 100 columns. All right, then we have them typed it in much the same way we had people type things in for an array. So again, instead of a single loop, we have the double loop set up. For I equals 0, I less than rows, which they just typed in. For j equals 0, j less than columns, which they just typed in. And then we use I and j as our indexes inside of the 2D array so that they can type things into basically the different boxes of our table or our array, if you will. All right, so it'll start in row 0, and then we'll go through all of the columns one by one. Then it'll progress to row 1, and we'll go through all the columns one by one, progress to row 2, and so on and so forth. But by feeding I and j in as the indexes, we'll keep putting the numbers into a different place in our table. And again, the same set of loops can be used to print it back out. Again, the space in the inner loop and the cout after the inner loop will give you that table-like appearance. So if I was like, oh, I want to enter 3 rows and 2 columns, it'll then ask me for my different values, and then it's printing it out right there at the end. Okay. So that's the general idea. All right. It's very similar to an array, only instead of just having one long list of numbers, we now have a table of numbers. So the array has, instead of one index, it has 2 indexes, one for the rows, one for the columns. But everything else that we learned about arrays is still going to sort of apply here. All right, the column and row indexes start at 0. We can treat the individual elements almost as like unique variables. We can use them in calculations. We can use them to save things in. We can print them out. We can input into them. All the stuff that we've been doing, we can still do. So this is the structure. What are you actually going to be doing with it today? All right. So if we bring up the lab, all right, there's a few different exercises. The first one says write code that will let the user specify the size of the table they want and then read in all the numbers they provide. All right, so we're going to actually do this one together to get you started. And then your actual activities start here with number 2. So using the matrix created in step 1, also called the 2D array, write code that will display a few different sums. The first goal will be to sum every element in the matrix, or the 2D array. So just going through the whole array, adding up every number inside of it. The second goal will be calculate a separate sum for each individual row. So for example, in this little example here, it would be saying, okay, the sum of the first row is 7, the sum of the next row is 9, the sum of the next row is 13. And then the third and final goal is to calculate a sum for each individual column. So again, going back to our example here, this first column has a sum of 14. This second column has a sum of 15. All right, so going through and calculating a bunch of different sums by moving through the table in sort of different directions. The first one, you just go through the entire table, then you look at the individual columns, then you look at the individual rows, or vice versa. All right. Number 3 says using the same table that was created above, write code that will transpose your original 2D array into a brand new array. So basically, you're going to take the columns and turn them into rows, or take the rows and turn them into columns. So 462, 573 becomes 462 across the top, 573 across the bottom. All right, the note that I provide on this one is you're not moving the numbers. So this isn't like the sorting algorithms where you have to like flip things. You're going to copy them into a blank array. So you'll have your existing array that you had them type into, and then you'll have a blank array where you sort of copy everything over, but in this new manner. All right. And then the last one, for it to work, we're going to specifically need a square array, meaning the rows and the columns are equal, so like 3 rows and 3 columns. And then you're going to work on calculating the sums of the diagonals. So it doesn't work for something like this because we don't have like an exact diagonal. But when you have a square array and there's the same number of rows as there are columns, then we can talk about diagonals. So in this little example here, there's 5 rows and 5 columns. So we'd be adding this box, this one, this one, and this one. And then in the other direction, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. All right. But that requires sort of a square array for it to work. So long story short, you're basically calculating a bunch of different sums and getting some introduction to working with 2D arrays and really playing with the loops to move through the arrays in different directions. So to move through the array, one row at a time when you're calculating your row sums. To move through the array one column at a time. I can't really highlight that, but move through the array one column at a time to get the column sums. How to move along the diagonal of the array to get those sums. So the arrays themselves, you're not going to be doing a whole lot with. It's more kind of how do I set up the loops? How do I structure the loops to move through the arrays in such a manner to get the sums and the calculations that I'm looking for. All right, so let's get started on the first one together, and then I will let you go from there. All right, so as usual, I'm going to just comment out all of this stuff so that we can have our new code right below that, but you've got examples to look at up above. All right. So I'm going to start by making my first array. So I could call it anything, but I'll call mine, we'll just call this the lab array. I'm going to make it 100 by 100 so that there's plenty of space in it. All right. And I'm going to initialize it to 0 so that I don't have to worry about anything being inside of it. All right. So I now have 100 rows numbered 0 to 99 and 100 columns numbered 0 to 99. All right. I'm going to make myself 2 loop variables, I and j, that I'm going to use to control my loops. And I'm going to make a variable for the number of rows that the person wants. And I'm going to make a variable for the number of columns that the person might want. All right. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is just ask them to enter how many rows they want and how many columns they want. All right. So how many rows do you want? And then I'm going to see in that into my rows variable. And I'm going to ask how many columns do you want? I'm going to see in that into my columns variable. And now that I know how much they want to enter, I can actually set up the loop that's going to take in that information. And by loop, I actually mean 2 loops because I need 2. I need one for the rows. So I'll do that as my outer loop. I equals 0 to I less than rows, where I gets 1 bigger. And then inside of that, a separate loop for my column. So j equals 0, j less than rows, where j gets 1 bigger. And then in here is where I'm going to actually allow them to sort of type in the information. So I'm going to say, cout, please enter. How do I want to format this? Please enter element. And then I'm going to kind of do it as almost coordinates. So I'm going to print out a parenthesis, print out I, I'll print out the comma and a space, and I'll print out J, and then I'll close my parentheses and have a colon. All right, and again, that's just formatting. It's just how I'm going to format it so that the user kind of knows where they're entering it. And then I'm going to cin, I'm going to use the name of my 2D array, which I called lab array. And then again, when you have your double brackets here, the first bracket is the row. So there's my I, because that's my row variable. The second bracket is my column variable. So that's where I'm going to put J. And then that's going to allow them to enter it. Now, you don't have to do this. This is not part of the lab. But if you want to see whether or not it worked correctly, I can take these loops. I can copy and paste them. Right? And instead of doing a cin, I can do a cout just to make sure that everything printed out correctly. So I'm going to cout my lab array of I and J, and I'm going to print out a space. And then when that inner loop is over, that means I've reached the end of a row. So I'm going to cout an endl so that I move down to a new row. Again, this isn't part of the lab. This is just for us to look at to make sure everything worked correctly. Now, as I'm doing this, I noticed that I typed rows both times, and that inner one should be columns. So I apologize for that, but luckily I caught it. So we're using rows for the outer, we're using columns for the inner. All right. So if I run this now, it's going to ask me how many rows I want. It's going to ask me how many columns I want. And then it's saying, please enter element 0, 0. So I'm just going to start typing in random numbers, 0, 1. All right, but notice I'm going across the row with a changing column. When I reach the end of the row, I go back to I drop down, and then the columns go back to 0. So I'll just keep doing this and typing in my numbers. And then there's the output just showing me that it did read incorrectly. I have 4 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, with 2 columns, and each one has the number that I typed in. Okay, so that's kind of your start to this lab. All right, where you're going to pick up from here is to start trying to calculate those different sums. All right, and each one is probably going to require some different loops that sort of move through the 2D array in a different fashion to sort of collect the information as you go. All right, so good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll go from there. All right, have a great day.